I've always had a fascination with the ocean. From the moment I first saw the shimmering surface of the sea, I knew it was something that called to me, a place of secrets and mystery that I wanted to understand. So naturally, marine biology became my path, and now, as a master's student, I was pursuing my thesis. My research was my life, but this opportunity was something I never expected. When the curator of the city's aquarium, Dr. Holden, called me to offer an overnight stay to study the mysterious lantern eel, I thought I was dreaming. The species had been recently discovered, and its bioluminescence was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. A glowing, undulating creature that exhibited behaviors no one could quite explain. Certainly, it would be the perfect subject for my research. I was excited, of course, ecstatic. But I also knew this wasn't just an ordinary research trip. There was something about it, something off, that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up the moment the offer was made. Dr. Holden was a quiet man, his features sharp like a man who'd spent his life underwater. He seemed to know the aquarium like the back of his hand, and there was a certain intensity in his eyes as he spoke, though he kept it hidden behind a polite smile.
You'll be the first to study the lantern eel overnight, but we have certain rules here. The place takes on a different atmosphere after hours. You'll need to follow the guidelines strictly.
I nodded eagerly, my mind racing with thoughts of the research I would get to do, of the data I would collect. This would be my breakthrough. He gestured toward the tanks as we walked, his voice taking on a slightly strained tone.
First, avoid the restricted areas. Those are off limits, even for you. Second, don't touch the tanks. I trust you to respect the boundaries here. And lastly, you must never, ever approach the restricted exhibit.
His eyes lingered on me for a moment, as if making sure I understood the severity of that last rule. I didn't ask what was in the restricted exhibit. Something in his gaze told me I didn't want to know. The air in the aquarium was thick with the scent of salt water, and the distant sound of water filters hummed through the halls like a low, mechanical lullaby. It felt oddly sterile, like I was walking through a place that had been frozen in time, where the exhibits were alive but untouched by the hands of humans. The soft, dim lighting gave everything an eerie glow, casting strange shadows across the tanks that seemed to move and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. We finally arrived at the lantern eel tank, and I felt a shiver run down my spine as I gazed into the murky water. The tank was large, more expansive than I expected, with intricate plants and rocks dotting the floor like an alien landscape. In the center, a soft glow pulsed from within the dark water, faint, almost imperceptible, but enough to catch my eye.
Here, they're particularly sensitive to the environment, so try to avoid disturbing the water too much. They're unpredictable.
I glanced at him, sensing there was more he wasn't saying, but he quickly turned and began to walk away, giving me a final, lingering look over his shoulder.
I'll lock the doors behind me. You'll be alone in here after dark. Keep your focus on the data.
He didn't need to say more. His tone had carried everything I needed to know. As the door clicked shut behind him, I was left in the eerie quiet of the aquarium, the faint hum of the filters the only sound in the otherwise still hall. The soft, greenish light from the lantern eel tank bathed the room, illuminating my workspace as I unpacked my equipment. Laptop, camera, notebooks, and a specialized underwater sensor to capture the fish's movements. I set everything up with a sense of purpose, but something in the air made me feel uneasy. I glanced at the tank again, my pulse quickening. The lantern eels were known for their strange behavior, glowing eyes, undulating bodies, and the way they seemed to watch people. But as I observed them more closely, I realized something wasn't quite right. Their glowing eyes, usually soft and diffused in their natural state, were now piercing, focused, locked onto me. I froze. They were watching me. I swallowed hard, unease crawling up my spine as the creatures swam in slow, deliberate circles, their light flickering and pulsing with each movement. It was almost as if they knew I was there, as if they were aware of my presence. Shaking my head, I tried to push the thought aside. It was probably just my nerves. After all, I was here to study them, to observe their behavior. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Suddenly, I heard the soft click of the door lock. Dr. Holden had left. The silence enveloped me, deep and suffocating. The only sound now was the faint rhythmic splash of water and the occasional hum of the filters. The stillness felt oppressive, like I was the only person alive in this vast space, surrounded by creatures that I barely understood. I turned back to the tank, and that's when I saw it again, their eyes, glowing and unblinking, following my every move. I couldn't tell if it was the bioluminescence of the eels or something more, but for a moment it felt like they were alive in a way that went beyond biology. They were aware, and that awareness, it unsettled me. I swallowed again, trying to push the thought away. It was just the stress of being here alone, I told myself. Still, the unease lingered. I bent over my equipment and began taking notes, trying to focus. But the more I observed the lantern eels, the more I became convinced of something strange about them. Their movements were deliberate, almost calculated. Each flicker of their light seemed to respond to my own actions. When I leaned in closer, they swam toward me. When I pulled back, they lingered at the edges of the tank, as if waiting for me to return. I had to get this data. This was the breakthrough I had been working toward. But the feeling of being watched, it wasn't something I could shake off. The evening wore on, and I found myself unable to relax. The dim lights, the soft pulse of water, the way the creatures seemed to keep an eye on me, it was all a bit too much. The clock ticked on. Dr. Holden's warning echoed in my mind. Don't approach the restricted exhibit. I couldn't help but wonder what was beyond that door, what secrets the aquarium held. But there would be time for that later. For now, I had my research to focus on. For now, I was alone. But in the dark corners of the aquarium, I could have sworn I heard something else moving. The eerie hum of the filters seemed louder now. I wasn't so sure I was truly alone after all. The quiet of the aquarium had a strange weight to it, almost oppressive. The filters hummed, the lights flickered softly, and the water, still and calm, seemed to carry an energy of its own. I couldn't explain it, but the longer I stayed in this place, the more I felt like I was being drawn into something deeper, something I couldn't see but knew was there. I turned my attention back to the lantern eels. Their bioluminescence, which I had initially thought of as a random, unremarkable glow, now seemed more deliberate. The pulsing light wasn't just random, it seemed to flicker in a rhythmic pattern, almost like communication. I set up my camera to capture their movements, my hands shaking slightly as I adjusted the lens. I had spent hours studying marine creatures, but this was something different. The eels moved in slow, graceful circles, their glowing bodies lighting up the dark water around them. And every now and then, one of them would dart toward the surface, as if it were reaching for something. Or perhaps someone. I leaned closer, focusing on their glowing bodies. The pattern, I realized, was deliberate. Their lights brightened and dimmed in synchrony, in a way that almost felt intentional. I quickly took notes, my mind racing to keep up with the data. This was something new, something that hadn't been observed before. The thought sent a thrill through me. The kind of thrill that came from discovering something no one else had. I was the first to study this behavior, and that realization was exhilarating. But, at the same time, a creeping sensation started to settle in the pit of my stomach. The eels. They were watching me. It wasn't just their glowing eyes following my every move, it was something deeper, something more aware. It felt as though they were reacting to me, not just the environment around them, but me, personally. The lights pulsed again, brighter this time, and I couldn't help but feel like they were trying to communicate. I shook my head, trying to push the feeling away. This was just biology. Just instinct. But the sensation lingered. I recorded everything meticulously, trying to focus on the data, but it was hard to concentrate with the eels' constant, rhythmic glow filling my vision, their movements too precise, too deliberate. It was as if they were alive in a way that went beyond mere biology. After a while, I needed a break. I stood up, stretching the stiffness from my limbs, and walked through the dark halls of the aquarium. The silence here was different from anywhere else. It wasn't the peace of a quiet night. It was the kind of silence that felt like the calm before a storm. I wandered into the next room, where the other tanks were. I stopped in front of the octopus tank, watching as the creatures moved slowly across the glass. At first, it seemed like a normal, if not slightly eerie, sight. Tentacles curling, the smooth surface of their bodies shifting with liquid grace. But then, one of the octopuses did something I hadn't seen before. It reached out and pressed its sucker-covered tentacles flat against the glass, mimicking the movements of my own hand as I reached toward it. I froze. The creature's movements were too precise, too human. It didn't just reach for the glass, it reached for me, copying my every gesture. My breath caught in my throat, and I pulled my hand back, but the octopus stayed there, eyes locked with mine, its limbs still pressed against the glass. I couldn't tear myself away from its gaze, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker in its deep black eyes, something knowing. I shook my head, brushing off the sensation. "It's just a trick of the light," I muttered under my breath, trying to convince myself. But then I turned to the next tank. Jellyfish swam in slow, undulating motions, their translucent bodies glowing in eerie, unnatural shades of green and purple. Their usual soft, bioluminescent glow had taken on an otherworldly hue, far brighter, far more intense. I took a few steps closer, and I swear I saw the jellyfish shift their position as though they were observing me with an intent I couldn't quite place. I swallowed hard. I wasn't used to this. I had worked in aquariums before, but this was different. The creatures here felt aware of me, of my presence. A faint splashing sound caught my attention, and I whipped my head toward the far end of the hall. The noise was coming from the direction of the restricted exhibit. I had no reason to investigate. I knew Dr. Holden's rules, don't go near the restricted exhibit. But there was something in that sound, something that made me pause. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there, like something, or someone, moving in the dark. I hesitated, my feet frozen in place, the pull to investigate almost magnetic. But I shook my head, forcing myself to turn away. I couldn't risk it. I wasn't here for that. I had a job to do, and I was here to study the lantern eels. I made my way back to their tank, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that had settled over me. The quiet hum of the aquarium seemed louder now, more oppressive, and when I approached the tank again, I was hit by a sudden, sharp sensation that something had changed. My equipment, which I had carefully set up before leaving, was different. The camera was out of place, its lens pointed away from the tank. The notebook I had left on the table was open, pages turned, as though someone, or something, had been flipping through it. I felt a cold rush sweep over me. No one else was supposed to be here. No one could have accessed this area, not without me noticing. And yet, it was like someone or something had been examining my work. I shook my head, refusing to believe it. It had to be my imagination. Maybe I had knocked something over when I left in my haste. But as I set the camera back in place, I couldn't ignore the unease crawling up my spine. I turned my attention back to the lantern eels, trying to focus on the data. But when I looked into the tank, my heart skipped a beat. The eels were no longer moving in random patterns. No, now they were arranged in a perfect line, all facing the same direction. Their glowing bodies pulsed in unison, bright and steady at first, but then dimmed and brightened again in a pattern, one that was unmistakable. It was Morse code. I stared at the flashing lights, heart pounding in my chest, as the pulses formed a message. I quickly grabbed a notebook and jotted down the sequence, my hand shaking as I wrote. ... The message was clear. Run. I froze, my blood turning to ice. It wasn't a coincidence, it couldn't be. Something was wrong, something was horribly wrong, and I had no idea what I had just stepped into. The air in the aquarium felt thicker now, the silence pressing against my eardrums, making it hard to focus. The distant hum of the filters had changed, becoming louder, more urgent, like the heartbeat of something alive in the shadows. But it wasn't just the filters I heard now. There was a strange bubbling sound, a sort of gurgling that came from deep within the tanks, as if the water itself was breathing. I glanced around uneasily. The soft creaking of the glass tanks seemed more pronounced, like the structure of the building was groaning under the weight of the night. The sound was unsettling, as though the aquarium itself was waking up, shifting, moving. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I stepped away from the lantern eel tank, my pulse still quick from the warning they'd sent me. Run. Those words echoed in my mind, but I couldn't run. Not yet. I needed to understand what was happening. I needed to see if the behavior of the other animals had changed too. I wandered through the dark hallways, drawn to the other exhibits. My footsteps echoed too loudly in the silence, and as I passed by a tank, something caught my attention. A shark. It swam in tight, endless circles, its mouth gaping wide as though it were silently screaming, but there was no sound, no movement beyond the slow, hypnotic rotation of its body. It should have been hunting, should have been cruising in a more natural pattern, but instead it looked like it was trapped in an endless loop of madness. The way it kept its mouth open, wide and unblinking, sent a chill crawling up my spine. I swallowed, forcing myself to look away. There was no time for panic. I had to stay calm. But as I moved on, I couldn't ignore the strange tension that filled the air. Next, I found a sea turtle. It hovered in front of the glass, its large, bulbous eyes unblinking, staring directly at me. There was no flicker of movement in its gaze, no sense of curiosity or the slow, deliberate motions I was used to seeing in sea turtles. It simply stared, watched me. I felt a shiver run down my back as I slowly backed away, but the feeling didn't leave. It wasn't just the shark or the turtle. There was a pervasive sense of being observed. I moved down the hallway to the jellyfish tank, hoping the soft, fluid movements of the jellyfish would help calm my nerves. But as I stood there, watching them undulate through the water, I felt a sudden, inexplicable jolt of fear. A shadow moved behind the glass. I blinked, thinking I was seeing things, but when I looked closer, I could swear I saw the silhouette of a person, tall and thin, reflected in the glass. I turned quickly, heart racing, but the hallway behind me was empty. No one, not a sound. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to rationalize it. It must have been the angle of the light. But then, the shadow in the glass shifted again, and I could see it more clearly this time. Tall, gaunt, with long, outstretched limbs. It didn't make sense. The reflection couldn't possibly be from me, not unless I was standing in the exact same spot, but I hadn't moved. My hands shook as I turned back to the jellyfish. The strange light they emitted, the vivid greens and blues, now seemed unnatural, unsettling, and the silhouette, it felt wrong. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. It's just your mind playing tricks on you. But the unease kept creeping up my spine. The water in the tank rippled. I could see it, clear as day. It wasn't from the filtration system. It was as if something in the water had moved, like a pulse or a shift. I stepped closer, eyes widening as the water swirled unnaturally. The ripples didn't make sense. The pattern didn't match the current or the filtration system. It was as if something beneath the surface was stirring. I felt a chill settle over me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to move, to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. As I moved deeper into the aquarium, I stopped dead in my tracks. Wet footprints. They were small, barely visible against the stone floors, but they were there, leading down the hallway toward the restricted exhibit. The same uneasy pull I'd felt earlier, the sense of something lurking just out of sight, surged in my chest. I stared at the footprints, my mind racing. I didn't want to follow them. I knew I shouldn't. I had been warned to stay away from the restricted exhibit. Dr. Holden had been very clear. But the footprints, they beckoned. There was something so inexplicably wrong about them, and yet they felt like the key to everything I was experiencing. Without thinking, I took a step forward. Then another. The trail led me down the dark hallway, toward the heavy steel door marked with a faded sign that read, "Authorized personnel only." The door was slightly ajar, as if someone or something had left it open. My heart pounded in my chest, and every instinct told me to turn back, to leave this place and never come back. But I couldn't. Something pulled me in. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was massive, far larger than I'd imagined. The faint light from the hallway barely illuminated the space, but what I saw in the dark corners sent a cold shiver down my spine. A huge tank dominated the center of the room. It was murky, its water thick and dark, almost black. The glass was clouded, but there was something moving inside, something large. I took a tentative step closer, my breath coming quicker. My heart raced as I peered into the tank. The water was still, but I could feel it, the presence of something immense, lurking just beneath the surface. Then I saw it. Two glowing eyes, brighter than anything I'd ever seen before, appeared in the murkiness. They locked onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The creature, Whatever it was, watched me, motionless. And then, without warning, it disappeared into the depths, vanishing like a shadow, leaving nothing behind but the ripples in the water. I backed away, my hands trembling as I stumbled toward the door. My mind raced, every thought jumbled and incoherent. What was that thing? What was it doing here, in this tank, hidden from the world? And why had it looked at me? As I stood there, my mind reeling, I realized with a sudden clarity that I was no longer just an observer. I was part of this. Whatever was happening here, whatever had begun in the dark depths of this aquarium, it was coming for me. The moment the lights flickered, I froze. I thought it was just a glitch, maybe the aging electrical system finally giving out, but then they flickered again. The hum of the aquarium, the soft whirring of the filters, all of it fell silent in an instant, and then darkness. I blinked rapidly, trying to adjust my eyes, but there was nothing but pitch black. The faint red glow of the emergency lights blinked to life, casting everything in a blood-soaked hue. The aquarium, once quiet and still, now felt like a vast, alien labyrinth. The eerie red lighting did little to reassure me, only amplifying the sense that something was very, very wrong. The first sound I heard was the distant, sharp crack of glass shattering. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't just a crack, it was multiple cracks. Glass breaking all around me. I stood motionless, listening to the chaos unfolding in the darkness. Tanks were being shattered, the creatures, everything was escaping. I heard the wet slither of something heavy moving through the halls. The lantern eels. I didn't need to see them to know. Their bioluminescence, so bright in the dark, began to pulse like a swarm of fireflies, casting twisted, jittering shadows across the walls. The patterns they formed were wrong, unnatural. They didn't move like eels anymore. They moved like a horde. Their glowing bodies winding across the floor in patterns that made no sense, slithering and twisting as if they were communicating. No, this isn't happening. This isn't real. My thoughts were frantic, every instinct screaming at me to get out, to run. But my feet wouldn't move. My body was frozen, locked in place by fear. I forced myself to turn and run, my breath coming in jagged gasps as I stumbled through the darkness. The eerie red glow barely illuminated the hall, casting everything in an unholy light. I reached the staff room, my mind desperate for a place to hide. I slammed the door behind me and began to push the heavy furniture in front of it. Desks, chairs, anything I could use to barricade myself. But as I did, I heard it. The unmistakable slap of wet, sticky tentacles against the door. Gurgling. Groaning. I swallowed a scream, my heart in my throat. Someone was on the other side. Something with tentacles. The wet, rhythmic sound of them dragging along the door made my skin crawl. The growls, the guttural growls, like they came from the depths of the sea, filled the air. It wasn't an animal's cry. It was something else. Something ancient, hungry. I couldn't stay here. The door wouldn't hold forever. I had to move. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam of light weak and flickering, and pushed the barricade aside. I wasn't thinking clearly anymore, but I couldn't let myself stop. I had to find an exit. I had to get away. I stumbled into the hallway, the flashlight's beam dancing wildly, barely illuminating the world around me. As I moved deeper into the aquarium, my chest tight with panic, I saw something, a movement in the distance. A shape. A figure, the massive tank from the restricted exhibit. The one with the murky water. The one with the eyes. I had to get there. I had to understand. But when I reached the tank, what I saw nearly made me fall to my knees in horror. It was free. The creature. The massive, grotesque creature from the dark tank. It loomed over me, its body a horrific amalgamation of marine life, tentacles, gills, and fins tangled together in a grotesque symphony of flesh. Its eyes glowed, pulsed, in the same eerie bioluminescence as the lantern eels, but far brighter, far more unsettling. And the veins. Pulsating veins. The creature's entire body seemed alive with glowing veins, a network of light running through its translucent, gelatinous skin. It was like it had been stitched together from nightmares. Its multiple predatory mouths, opening and closing in a grotesque rhythm. It looked at me with an intelligence far beyond what any marine creature should possess, and I realized with a cold shock that I was no longer just a witness to something unexplainable. I was the prey. But it wasn't just the creature. It was them. The other marine creatures, the ones that had escaped their tanks, had all gathered around the creature. The sharks, the octopuses, the jellyfish, they were no longer mindless animals. They moved with purpose, like soldiers following orders. They didn't look confused or disoriented. They looked like they were waiting for something, waiting for it. And the creature, it, seemed to command them. The lantern eels slithered into the hallway, their glowing bodies weaving around the other animals like threads in a dark tapestry. The jellyfish floated through the air, their tendrils trailing behind them like glowing ribbons of death. And the sharks circled, their sharp teeth glistening in the dim light, their eyes unblinking, focused, and they were moving closer. I backed away slowly, my mind a blur, every instinct screaming at me to run. But the halls seemed longer now, more oppressive. There was no escape. They were cornering me. I glanced desperately to my right, the emergency exit. I ran, my feet pounding the cold stone floors, but the creatures followed. Their movements were coordinated, almost surgical. The lantern eels led the charge, slithering through the cracks and corners, their bodies forming eerie patterns in the dark. The sharks were right behind them, swimming through the air with horrifying precision, their mouths open, ready to strike. I could hear the wet slap of tentacles, the gurgling growls that vibrated through the walls. They were closing in. They were hunting me. I reached the emergency exit door, pulling at the handle with shaking hands. But it was locked. Of course, it was locked. I turned to face the creatures, my flashlight flickering in my hand. The large creature, the one from the restricted exhibit, loomed in the doorway, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. And I realized, with a sickening jolt of clarity, that it wasn't just hunting me. It was leading them. I was trapped, surrounded, with no way out. I was no longer an observer in this place. I was the prey. I ran. The creatures were everywhere now, their glowing eyes trailing me in the dark like 1,000 watching beacons. They were moving too fast, too coordinated. The lantern eels were the first to reach me. I didn't see it coming. A sudden, slick weight wrapping itself around my ankle, tugging me to the floor. The electric burn of their bioluminescence flared in my vision as the eel coiled tighter, pulling my leg into the cold darkness. I screamed, kicking and thrashing, but the eel's grip was strong, unyielding. I could hear the sound of its body slithering and constricting, the wet slaps against the floor growing louder, the eerie hiss of its movement like a warning. I managed to pry it off just long enough to scramble free. But it wasn't done. It shot toward me again, the light from its body casting grotesque shadows as it lunged for my throat. But I didn't have time to think. I rolled out of the eel's reach, my heart hammering in my chest. I scrambled to my feet, barely registering the sharp, sudden crash of something in the distance, a wall of glass shattering with the force of an explosion. I turned, just in time to see it. The octopus. It crashed through the tank, its massive, gelatinous body breaking through the glass as if it were nothing. The tentacles reached toward me like a storm, writhing and coiling with predatory speed. One of the limbs wrapped around my waist, dragging me toward its gaping maw. The suction cups bit into my skin, leaving welts as it hauled me toward the murky water of the broken tank. The air was thick with the stench of salt water, and something worse. Something sour, like rot. I could barely breathe. Panic surged through my body. I can't die here. I pushed the thoughts away, ignoring the screaming panic inside me. I yanked the flashlight from my pocket and swung it wildly, smashing the beam into the soft underside of the octopus's arm. The creature recoiled slightly, and I took the opportunity to rip myself free, stumbling back into the hall. I didn't stop. I couldn't. It was clear now. They weren't just random attacks. They weren't acting of their own volition. The eels, the sharks, the octopus. They were all controlled. I could feel it. I could sense it now, deep in my gut. It was as though they were being commanded. But by what? By who? My mind spun. The massive creature from the restricted exhibit. It wasn't just lurking in the shadows. It was leading them. It was orchestrating this madness, controlling everything, pulling the strings like a puppeteer. It wasn't just alive. It was thinking. It was in control. I ran down the corridor, my thoughts racing faster than my footsteps. I had to find something, anything, to explain what was happening here. I needed to understand. I fumbled for my phone, but my pockets came up empty. Panic clawed at my throat. No, no, no. I had it. It was right there. I stopped dead in my tracks. My phone was gone. The world seemed to tilt, a dizzying swirl of confusion and fear. Where was it? Before I could search further, a crackling sound broke through the silence, static followed by a distorted voice.
You should not have come here.
The voice was low, guttural. It sent a chill of recognition down my spine. It was him. The curator. Dr. Holden. But something was wrong. There was a static quality to his words, as if the voice wasn't quite his own. As if it had been twisted. I couldn't waste any more time. I stumbled into a small office, my breath coming fast and ragged. My pulse thundered in my ears as I scanned the cluttered desk. There had to be something, anything, that could help me understand what was happening. I rifled through drawers, pulling out papers, a broken pen, old records. But then I found it. A staff manual. I yanked through the pages with desperate speed. The aquarium's policies, the history, the guidelines for emergencies. It was all standard stuff. Until I reached the back. A small, barely noticeable section titled Experiment X. I stared at it, my hands trembling as I read the words. My breath hitched. It was an experiment, one that had gone horribly wrong. Experiment X, a failed genetic manipulation of marine life, an attempt to create the perfect organism. They had tried to combine the traits of several species, to create something stronger, faster, smarter. But the creature they had engineered, the one from the restricted exhibit, had evolved far beyond their expectations. The experiment had backfired. The creature had developed an ability to control other marine life, turning them into part of a collective, a hive mind organism, a sentient hive mind. The creature was the queen, and everything else, every eel, every shark, every octopus, was part of it, following its command. I felt bile rise in my throat. This wasn't just an outbreak, it wasn't just some isolated incident. This was a planned experiment gone wrong, an intelligent, predatory organism, controlling everything, using the aquarium's animals like pawns in a sick, twisted game. But I wasn't done yet. I couldn't be. I couldn't fight the creature head-on. I couldn't defeat it with strength. But I could use the aquarium's systems. I remembered the filtration system, the tanks, the water, the air. There was a way to flood the air with chemicals that could stun the creatures. The staff manual mentioned it, a last-ditch attempt to neutralize the experiment in case it got out of control. I wasn't sure it would work, but it was my only shot. I pushed myself up, ignoring the dull ache in my body. I had to get to the control room. I had to trigger the chemicals before it was too late. I had one chance. One. And the clock was ticking. I barely made it to the control room. The heavy thud of something massive crashing through the walls behind me spurred me forward, my feet stumbling across the slick, damp floors. The creature, the hind entity, was relentless. Its massive, pulsating body tore through the aquarium's structure, destroying tanks and walls as it chased me. Each roar, each crack, felt like the earth itself was collapsing under the weight of it. I pushed open the door to the control room, praying it would be unlocked. And it was. My hands were slick with sweat, my body trembling with exhaustion and terror, but I forced myself to step inside and slam the door shut behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I turned to the control panel. The filtration system. I had to release the chemicals. It's my only chance. The room felt small and suffocating. The air was thick with the sound of crashing and rumbling, the walls vibrating under the impact of something far too large to be contained. I scrambled to the console, pressing buttons blindly, my mind too fogged with fear to think clearly. But I knew what I needed to do. I needed to flood the air with the chemicals. If I could just... A shriek split the air. A sound unlike anything I had ever heard before. I spun around, heart slamming in my chest. A swarm of jellyfish poured into the room, their translucent bodies glowing with an eerie, pulsing light. Their tentacles, long and sinuous, whipped through the air, lashing out at me like a storm of burning, electric whips. I screamed as one of them wrapped around my arm, the searing pain making my vision blur. The tentacles tightened, dragging me toward the open door, toward the creature that I knew was just outside. No. No. I fought back with everything I had, but the jellyfish were too strong, their burning sting paralyzing me with pain. They were relentless, dragging me closer to the gaping maw of the entity, its glowing eyes gleaming in the darkness. But I wasn't done. Not yet. I gathered every ounce of strength left in my body, and with a feral cry, I wrenched myself free from the jellyfish's grip. I stumbled back, the room spinning around me, my skin raw and burning where their tentacles had touched. I didn't think. I just moved. I turned back to the control panel and punched in the final sequence to activate the filtration system. The air hissed as chemicals began to flood the tanks, sending an invisible wave of sedation through the air. The system whirred to life, and I felt a strange calmness settle over me. But the calm didn't last long. A deep, guttural roar tore through the facility, so deafening it rattled my bones. I knew it was the creature, enraged and desperate. It was too late. It had caught up to me. But then, something extraordinary happened. The creatures, all of them, the jellyfish, the sharks, the eels, the octopus, began to convulse. Their bodies twitched, jerking in unnatural, violent spasms. The pulsating glow of the lantern eels flickered erratically before finally dimming completely. The sharks' predatory eyes dulled, their movements slowed. The jellyfish drifted limply in the air, their tentacles no longer reaching for me. The entire aquarium seemed to be gasping for air, every creature fighting against the chemicals in the air. But it was futile. The hive-mind entity's roar turned into a gurgling hiss, a last desperate scream, before it crumpled. Its massive, pulsating body collapsed to the floor, its glowing veins dimming, flickering, and finally fading to black. The creature was dead. Or at least, it was no longer alive in the way it had been. I staggered backward, my heart still racing, my body trembling with the aftermath of the struggle. It was over. But I didn't feel relief. I stumbled out of the aquarium at dawn, the cold air biting into my raw skin. The first light of day broke through the darkness, casting a pale, eerie glow across the wreckage of the aquarium. The emergency crews arrived just as I did, rushing to the scene in response to the silent alarm triggered by the filtration system. The paramedics swarmed me, checking my burns, my cuts, and the shock in my eyes. I tried to explain what happened, what I had seen, but they only gave me blank stares, shaking their heads like I was a victim of some kind of hallucination.
It was a gas leak. It caused disorientation. You've been under a lot of stress, miss.
My stomach twisted, but I couldn't argue. I had no evidence. No one would believe me. The aquarium would deny everything. They would cover it up. The story would never see the light of day. As they escorted me away, I looked back at the aquarium. The glass walls, cracked and shattered, reflected the first rays of dawn. But the reflection I saw in the broken glass wasn't just mine. There, in the reflection, my eyes widened as I saw her, another version of me, staring back with a subtle, knowing smile. I froze. It wasn't just a reflection, it blinked, and I didn't. I turned away from the mirror, my heart stopping in my chest. Was I still being watched? Was I still part of something bigger than myself? I couldn't escape it. Not yet. The abyss hadn't let me go, and somehow I knew it never would.